Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Using the CELF5 Metalinguistics Battery to Assess Higher-Level Language Skills webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, May 29th, 2014. I would now like to turn the conference over to Nancy Castilla. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. If you're listening to the live webinar event and not a recording on our website, and you wish to earn ASHA CEUs for this course, you must attend the entire one-hour session and complete the ASHA CEU participant form and return it to Darlene Davis. Those of you who registered for the webinar for the live event have her address in your email. We will also send it to you again in the email following the webinar. The forms that you complete must be postmarked by June 6, 2014. ASHA requires us to remind you that you cannot decide to earn ASHA CEUs for this course after this date. If you are on the line for less than 60 minutes, or if you do not turn in the ASHA CEU participant form postmarked by June 6, you will not have the opportunity to earn ASHA CEUs for this course at some later date. Only those participants who follow the instructions and meet ASHA requirements for earning CEUs will have their course information submitted to the ASHA CE registry. No CEUs are offered for the recording of this session that is available after today's date on the website. That being said, I'll now turn it over to Dr. Adam Scheller. Adam?
Thanks, Nancy. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could all come today. We're going to be talking about the CELF5 Metalinguistics assessment. In particular, we're going to talk about we're going to go over higher-level language skills, briefly, and then we're going to talk about the Metalinguistics test and how it's used to assess higher-level language skills. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I know some folks have probably been on my webinars before, but just to give you a quick background on myself, I am a senior educational consultant with Pearson. I'm also a psychologist. I'm a licensed psychologist. And when I was putting together the presentation for this test, I found a lot of really useful components to it, and I really enjoyed it, and hopefully you will too today. This was, I did a lot of assessment for kids on the autism spectrum and even young adults, older kids with higher level autism functioning. So I found this assessment very, very useful and very interesting. So hopefully you will as well. Let's get going today, though, because we do have an hour, and I want to make sure that I'm able to stay within that hour today so you guys can all do your CE stuff. Quickly, though, I do have a disclosure. Of course, it's a financial disclosure since I am an employee of Pearson. We're just going to be talking about the CELF5 Metalinguistics test, and Pearson publishes that test. So here are the learning objectives for today. We're going to talk about the purpose of the test. You're going to be able to at least talk about 3 tests that comprise the battery. We're going to go over all of them, of course. We're going to talk about a couple slides here about the CELF5 Metalinguistics test and how that differs from the Test of Language Competence, the TLC-E, because this is a revision of the original TLC-E that was published in. This revision was in 1988, so it's been a while since it was revised. But this revision really does represent a complete overhaul of that test, and I'll show you some of the differences there. We are also going to, at the end, talk about these last two in terms of a clinical situation or a type of situation where you may want to consider administering this test, as well as a situation where you may not feel that you'd get accurate information from this test. So I want you to think of those last two as I'm talking throughout the entire session today. Those are going to be learning objectives, probably in your CE documents. I don't have specific slides that I'm going to say, hey, this is where you need to think about this, but I'd like you to think about these and really kind of keep these in your mind as I'm going through today, because I think for those of you who do a lot of assessment with kids with higher level language skills, to assess more higher level language, you'll see a lot of what I'm talking about as we go through. But let's give a quick start here to just review what metalinguistics are and what the skills are. And the way that I'm thinking about it here is in terms of how we demonstrate metalinguistic awareness. And the way that that's demonstrated is when we see students, children, even adults for that matter, be able to talk about, analyze, and think about language in a way that is really independent of the concrete meaning of each word. So we're thinking here about being able to, there are a lot of social types of language here, inference, etc. We are talking about higher level abilities rather than just separating out each word and talking about each word independently. Interestingly enough, when we think about kids with language disorders, and I saw this quite frequently in kids that I had in social skill groups, etc., who would receive social skill intervention, but also when I would work pretty cooperatively with SLPs, talking about language interventions as well. A lot of kids with overall language disorders would be able to acquire an adequate amount of this linguistic knowledge, and talking about semantics, morphology, syntax, and pragmatics, and then often perform average or low average on tests like the CELF4, CELF5, for example. They would be able to do fairly well on those tests, and their language difficulties don't tend to show up there. It's interesting because when you think about that, there is that developmental bridge, or you think about it as a developmental bridge between metalinguistic awareness and metacognitive abilities that are, and they're separate from linguistic skills. There is that developmental pathway. We think of metalinguistics as being a higher level developmental ability, and if children or young adults haven't passed over that yet, we do start to see that even though their language may be quote unquote intact, they have a difficult time, with this high-level skills. So I've seen many cases, and I'm sure you all have as well, where kids do fairly well on the linguistic skills based on their interventions, but then can't really pass over to those higher-level skills. So, the important thing to think about when we're talking about even academics is that these higher-level skills do impact academics overall, metalinguistics. And these are just some areas that we know based on research that metalinguistic skills do impact a child's academic performance. And the first one there is the ability to make and understand inferences, then using and understanding multiple meaning words, using figurative language and humor, formulating spoken or written sentences that meet cultural expectations for conveying messages or expressing emotions or opinions. And you often do see this come out in not only social interactions at school, but also in writing, in children's written language, and also in some higher level reading. So you do see this really start to impact a child's academics overall. I do have a question here from Irene talking about TLC. I'm going to get to some of that question as we go along, Irene, so hopefully if I don't answer that as we go along, I will come back to that one question. Just I have a question coming through talking about the differences between TLC and the metalinguistics, and I will get to that, I promise. In terms of this assessment, the CELF5 Metalinguistics test, what is its real purpose? And, of course, we think of it as being, it should be used to identify students who haven't acquired the ability to, the expected levels of language competence and metalinguistic ability for their age. So it's very straightforward. If we know that if we're seeing kids that have difficulty with figurative language or multiple meaning words, etc., all that I just talked about, this is a test that should be used to identify, where those kids are and identify that weakness. This is also a test that as I mentioned before, those kids who have typical performance on CELF or typical performance on another language test where you're really not picking up those subtleties of the language disorder, using a test like this, the metalinguistics test, will be able to pull out a lot of those difficulties, and really be able to identify a lot of those difficulties a little bit easier. Let's just give a quick overview of it. This is, of course, a revision of the TLC-E, as I talked about, with many updated test items appropriate for today's students. It was interesting when I was thinking about when it was developed in 1988, and just the differences in language and the differences in expectations and who people were and students and children were back in 1988 versus today. So, it is very updated for that very purpose, or it is updated for that very purpose. We do have a battery of 5 standalone tests, the metalinguistics profile, making inferences, conversation skills, multiple meanings, and figurative language. And why I have that in red is it's very important to know that each of these tests or each of these measures can be used by itself. You don't have to sit down and give all five tests every single time. You can actually pull out one or another based on some of the difficulties that you think you may want to assess for. So they are standalone, and you can use them in that manner. We do have the ages from 9-0 through 21-11, and I think that what's real important to think about with that is these higher level language skills. When I was, and I think that this, Irene, may get to your question a little bit. When I was thinking about this change in age, and I was thinking about the skills that we are assessing with this type of a test, the 9-year-old age range is really an appropriate time when we can really think about when these skills should be developed, or at least at a level where we can accurately assess them. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and it's funny because I try to use sarcasm, and I try to show her multiple meanings of words and etc. Oftentimes, and in different types of humor. I try to teach her that, but being 5, she doesn't get it yet. May get 1 or 2 here or there, but she doesn't get it yet, and it's just she's not at that developmental level. So, thinking about this type of an assessment, going from 9 through 21 is a more appropriate age range to be developing for. In addition, we're talking about a 30 to 45 minute administration time, and of course that's going to be depending on age and ability level. That's always very typical. We think about if a kid has higher level skills, it's going to take a little bit longer than for a kid who has lower skills. So why would we use the CELF5 Metalinguistics test? Well, it is, again, designed for students who have adequate linguistic knowledge, talking about kids who can understand basic concepts and, of course, speaking grammatically correct sentences. But then those kids who lack the skills needed for grades 3 and up, metalinguistics that are needed for grades 3 and up. It is ideal for students with subtle language disorders, really getting at those subtle disorders, and for kids on the autism spectrum. Tammy, the 30 to 45 minute administration time is for the entire battery, for all 5. Well, one of them is I'll show you in a second. One of them is actually a checklist, but so it's not really administered, but it is for the entire test. So let's talk about some of the differences between CELF5 and TLC-E. In the TLC, each of the group of test items was a subtest. We were talking about a specific subtest, but the Metalinguistics test was developed as a battery for each of the separate tests to be delivered either together or separately if you wanted to, and it really does allow you to really use each of those tests independently if necessary. So they are referred to as a test now. All of the items from TLC were either substantially revised or they were deleted. You can imagine, even though some of it is still applicable, of course, and you have to use it with caution, from 1988 until 2014, there's a lot of differences that had to be overcome. So all of the items were either substantially revised or deleted. Revised items do include demonstration, trial, and test items, coming from the TLC. The age range, again, was changed from 5 to 9 through 21. Additionally, there were age-based start points and discontinue rules that were introduced on the CELF5 Metalinguistics, and of course that's to shorten administration time, really cleaning that up and being able to make sure you're starting and stopping and reducing the overall admin time for that. The record form was updated, and of course it has introductory information prior to each test. I'll show you some of that as we go along. Item and or error analysis tables, and whenever I see that, I get very excited. Whenever I test frequently, I love to look at item and error analysis. I don't know what that says about me, but I will show you some of those as we go along too. I think it's very valuable to be able to analyze actual skill deficits and consistencies across tests. So I'll show you some of those as we go along too. A score summary that includes a discrepancy comparison. We can look at discrepancies between different scores, and of course a profile area where test scores and index scores can be plotted. There was an expressive component added to Making Inferences, which is a good component. I'll show you that as we go along. And the scoring rubrics were revised for each test to make the test easier to score and improve the reliability. Additionally, I do have a couple more. The metalinguistics profile that I talked about is, again, really being able to look at these language skills in context, which is a really valuable tool. It is a checklist. It does allow clinicians to compare a student's performance in the everyday settings with the performances you find on the test. The composite score was revised again. We replaced the TLC interpreting intents and expressing intents composite scores with the Metalinguistics metapragmatics and metasemantics index scores. And I'll talk a little bit more about what each of those mean. Okay. Also, they eliminated the TLC screening composite score due to really the overall shortened administration time of the CELF5 Metalinguistics test. Okay, let's actually get into some of the tests now and talk about the test batteries. But that profile that I mentioned before, it is a profile, and after you observe the student, you can obtain additional information from. We're really looking at one or more informants. We're thinking about teachers and/or parents and caregivers, and I always think best practice as getting as much information as you can. However, if you can just get it from one, you can do that. And of course, we're looking at kids who are familiar with the student and can complete the rating scale. This profile can be completed before or after testing, and it does give you a norm reference score, which is really great for comparison purposes. And I have very high reliability in quotation or in parentheses there. I don't have the exact reliability number on me right now, but I can tell you that when you see it in the tech manual, it is a very high number. There are the two tests of metapragmatics that I talked about, and when I talk about metapragmatics, we are talking about the expression of appropriate responses to the communicative demands of a situation, and those two tests are making inferences and conversation skills. Additionally, there are the two tests of metasemantic skills, and of course, we're talking about appropriate understanding of language content as it relates to the larger communication context. And we're looking at multiple meanings and figurative language there. Okay, let's get into the profile in a little bit more detail, and I'll be able to show you some of that as we go along. But again, this is a test, or this is a checklist that you can use to evaluate these skills in context. And of course, that's very important when we're thinking about language disorder, and we're thinking about how language weaknesses can impact a child overall. Again, it is a rating scale. You can complete it before or after testing. You are basing the ratings on your observations as well as information you get from others. But you are the one, the SLP is the one completing the form. In this type of a profile, you do need to consider cultural influences, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, but, cultural influences when we look at observations of language and behavior and social interaction are very important to keep in mind. Again, it does yield a highly reliable norm reference score by age group, which is going to be really helpful when you're comparing actual performance on the tests to your observations. Rather than just having to do that qualitatively, you can do so quantitatively. When you think about the metalinguistics profile, we are rating on a Likert scale of 4. 1 is never, almost never, sometimes, often, always, or almost always, and this is pretty straightforward. Should be pretty standard for you to be able to fill out. So let's look at some of the examples. I have some example items up here, and the first one I have up here are what we consider words, concepts, and multiple meanings. And the first one would be, as culturally appropriate, of course. The student understands and uses abstract words appropriate for their age or grade. Kindness, paradigm, example. They understand and use multiple meaning words appropriately for their age or grade. Tip, office, those are just some examples. And they use knowledge of sentence structure to interpret ambiguous sentences. The chicken was ready to eat. And what does that mean? What are the multiple meanings of that sentence? Or what is the ambiguous meaning of that sentence, actually? Some of the inferences and prediction items, this number 11 would be differentiates fact from fiction in spoken and written information. 12 would be predict short and long-term effects of actions described in spoken or written information. And 13 predicts emotional reactions of characters in stories, novels, and plays. So again, as I was mentioning, you'd be going through each of these and you'd be, rating them based on that Likert scale of 1 to 4. And again, here, the last one, just the examples that I'll show you here are conversational knowledge and use questions, where you'd be asking, or you'd be rating the child based on these uses appropriate words to express complex intentions and thoughts, changes a register and interaction style to match participants' age, status, relationship, or special needs. Knows and follows expectations for social interactions within the schools and or community's culture. So, think about this. Think about what kind of a kid or what kind of a referral, what kind of a child you'd be working with, you would be looking for this information. Who would have this type of difficulty? What types of kids would you need to assess this for? Now, keep that in mind, because that's something that, I'd like to sort of get your thinking on later and have you guys put in information in the chat box as we go along. But why would you give this? What type of a child or what type of a specific issue would you be assessing with this type of question? Here is the first of the item analysis and item and error analysis type of a chart that I wanted to show you. This, again, is something that you'd find in the record form, so it's really handy for you to be able to analyze where these questions are. But based on the profile, the questions in the profile, you can actually break down what you're going to be evaluating based on specific questions that they're going to be asking. And I think that this is just a really helpful way to be able to track where kids are having difficulty. So if you know that if you're starting to see a child have, looking at the items, of course, has a lot of difficulty, has a great difficulty with figurative language, and you go back and review 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, questions 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. You may also want to evaluate questions that are very similar or categories that are very similar, such as ambiguity or inferences, and see whether or not you see some consistency there as well. When you look at this type of a profile or this type of a chart, it is important for you to think about each of the bolded items may appear in more than one category. So when you're looking at something, you have a kid who has figurative language difficulties, and you see questions 8 and 9 on here, you may also want to look at, like I showed you, ambiguity and inferences, and just think about how they overlap or how the questions overlap in terms of their assessment. So I think that this is, looking at these item analyses, once you pick up this test and once you go out and buy this test, this is going to be an area where I think you're going to find a lot of value to the analysis. So let's move on to the metapragmatic skills, and again, we're looking at the expression here and making inferences and conversational skills. So let's get started with making inferences. And again, you see here at the top, these are just start, reverse rule, repetitions, and discontinue rules for each of the tests. I have those listed in there. And what I think what you're gonna notice is, and what I want you to think about is this repetitions category. Repetitions are allowed here, so keep in mind that in mind as I go through this and why that would be important or what type of a situation you would value the repetitions. But you see for this test, we're starting with item 1 for all ages, and there's no reverse rule, and then we're stopping after 3 consecutive scores of 0. But in this type of a test, in making inferences, you have a stem book, has 2 statements followed by 4 response options, and I'll show you that in a minute. The first statement is a lead-in sentence, and of course that describes a context or initiates a chain of events. And then the second statement is a concluding sentence. Under that, there are going to be 4 response options that describe a potential inference that could be made given the lead-in and concluding sentences. You are going to read both the lead-in and concluding sentences and also the response options to this. You're going to ask them to read them to the student, and you're going to ask that student to identify 2 of the responses that best explain the concluding sentences and the concluding sentence, and then you are also going to ask them to provide an additional reason, making an additional inference that they could use to explain the concluding sentence. So here is, this is a trial example, an example of the trial. You would be saying to the students had to go safely outside for a fire drill. After the fire drill, Amy and Gary were called to the principal's office. Amy and Gary were called to the principal's office after the fire drill because they talked loudly during the drill. They walked out of the building quietly. They ran outside instead of walking. They both have a parent who's a firefighter. So, of course, the correct answers would be A and C, right? So we'd be expecting them to say A and C, and then we'd say, can you give us another, can you say another reason why they were called to the principal's office? And they could say something like, they pushed other kids when they were walking outside. That's another reason. So you'd be asking them to give you another inference. Okay? Here are some other examples. Oh, what I did want to mention, I always remember this too late. I apologize. I should have said this at the beginning, but You do, the handout was sent out to you. I think it was sent out yesterday, and it was sent out again today, so you would have that in your email. If you're looking at the handout, some of these slides are not in the handout, and of course the reason is because they're items, or they're, we want to be able to maintain security for these items. So that's why they're not in there. All right, but you guys should have the handouts in your email, or you do have the handouts in your email. So another one here is, so here are just some other examples. Tran and Anna were having lots of fun at the outdoor concert. They left early. Tran and Anna left early because the band was playing really terrific music. They had to be home before dark. They actually never liked outdoor concerts. They still had lots of homework to do. So, of course, B and D would be the responses, the appropriate responses there. Did have a question. Some of these seem to be very memory enhanced or reading skill. Actually, you are reading them to the child, so they don't have to read. You are reading them to them, and if you remember, just going back to the slide at the beginning, you can repeat as necessary. So there is no memory. There should be no memory component involved here. You're repeating as much as necessary, and they are not actually reading them. You are. Okay. Again, here is another one of those great charts that I like, the item and error analysis. You see here we have error categories listed, as well as the item response options. So really, when you look at something like this, you are able to really analyze what skills are being measured, and look at consistencies across errors. So if a child's making a lot of errors, where are they making them? What specific areas are they having difficulty with? This type of a thing really should start to really jog your memory, or jog your thinking about interventions. What are you going to put into place for treatment for these children? Picking specific areas of consistent weakness out of here would really be helpful for that. Next test, conversation skills. So in this test, the student is shown a page in the stimulus book. It has a picture there with 2 or 3 target words above it. You are going to be reading the words to them, and you're going to ask them to use all of the words to make a sentence that one of the characters in the pictures could say. So here's an example here. You see the words don't and leg up at the top here. You would say something to them like, here's a picture of 2 students in a school hallway. Listen to the words I heard one of them say. Don't, leg. Tell me a sentence one of the students could have said using the words don't, leg. Make sure your sentence is about the picture and that all the words are in it. The words can be used in any order. So, an example sentence in this situation could be something like, the girl could have said something like, don't fall and hurt your leg. Or you could say, the boy could say something like, I hurt my leg, so I don't think I should hang any more of these banners. So in that situation, of course, they're looking at the context, they're looking at the situation, they are using the 2 legs to initiate that conversation between the 2 of them. Here are some more examples. You see this picture here, when and toast. You could say something like, oh boy, listen to this, I'm having difficulties here. Why would that be? When I'm finished with this egg, I'd like to put it on the toast. Or when I finish cooking this egg, I'd like to put it on my toast, or something like that. So, you see how they get a little bit more difficult with 3 words. Okay? So they go up in difficulty as you go along. So when we look at the error analysis here, or the item analysis, the first part of the conversation skill error analysis, item analysis, is the semantic syntactic function. So here are the categories. We're looking at noun, pronoun, etc., and the conjunctions. So this is just a chart. Of course, this is again on the record form where you can actually pick out which items are using which categories or conjunctions. So you can actually pick those out, and it'll list it for you. Excuse me. So for the verbs, you see there, item 2 is using toast, 3 practice, 4 is walk, 5 is watch, 7 is have, and 11 is worried. So you can actually pick out which words they're actually using and which category they fall in. And the second part is content use and form. So we're looking at pragmatic errors, semantic errors, and syntactic errors. And it, again, shows you all the items that have those in them, or where those errors are occurring. So let's say that they have some syntactic errors. You'd be circling each one that they had difficulties with. Circle all the error types as appropriate. Okay? So let's move on to the metasemantic skills. And, of course, we are talking again here about the appropriate understanding of language content in larger communication context. And the two tests that I talked about before are multiple meanings and figurative language. So when we think about how we assess this, multiple meanings is I just have a little clip here just to show you, and then I'll get into them in a little bit more detail. But multiple meanings would be something like your glasses are dirty. What are the multiple meanings involved in that, and being able to understand the multiple understand that based on the context of what your conversation is. Figurative language also, again, in a situation, a boy is talking to his little brother who wants to play a game with him, and the expression is "get lost." And what exactly does that mean? Does he actually want him to go get lost, or does he want him to leave him? Does the older brother want him to leave alone so he can play his game, etc. And understanding exactly what that means. So the first one here, multiple meanings. Again, we have the two different age start points: 9 through 12 start at item 1, 13 through 21 start at item 4. We do have a reversal rule here because we have a different age group. So any of the children starting at the second item or the second start point, which is item 4, they have to get a perfect score on 2 consecutive items from the start point. If not, they go back to item 1 and they test forward. So this is not a situation where you test in reverse. You'd be testing. You go back to the first start point and go forward. You can repeat as allowed or as necessary. It's allowed, and then you could discontinue after 3 consecutive scores of 0. So in this test, the student would be shown a sentence in the STEM book, and it contains ambiguity at either the word or sentence level. So there is 2 different levels here. We have sentence and word level. And the clinician would read the sentence aloud and then ask the student to describe 2 meanings for each of the sentences, for each sentence. So here's an example. He wrote several letters, and you'd be asking, at this situation, after you read this, you'd be asking the child to be able to give you 2 different meanings for this sentence. Of course, the first one would be that he wrote out letters to someone, saying something, communicating with someone, or he wrote out letters individually, like A, B, C, D. That would be 2 different meanings for that. This one would be Andrea moved 1 foot to the left. It could be she moved her entire body 1 foot to the left, or she could have actually moved either her right or left foot to the left. Visiting relatives can be annoying. It's something like if you go to visit relatives, actually having to leave your house and go visit relatives, that could be annoying to you. Or the visiting relatives that you have coming into your house can also be annoying. Okay. Multiple meanings, and this is the item and error analysis here. We have lexical and structural categories, so you're able to analyze which items are looking at lexical items and which ones are structural. So you can actually separate that out again as well. All right, figurative language. We are looking at a test here that has, again, 2 different start points. It does, again, have a reverse rule because for children who are starting 13 through 21 who are starting at item 6, they would have to get 3 points on 2 consecutive items to go forward. If not, they have to go back to item 1. Again, repeating as necessary. And, there's a discontinue rule here, again, after 3 consecutive zeros. In this test, a child would be, or student would be shown a page in the book that contains a description of a situation, for example, the context, and a figurative expression that was used within that context. Then you would read the situation and expression aloud and ask the student to describe what the expression means. And then you will present 4 other figurative expressions in the STEM book and ask the student to select the one that has a meaning closest to the first expression. Here's an example. So the situation here is a mom worried that her teenagers will be late for school. The expression is, you guys need to step on it. And what exactly does that mean? Shake a leg, take your time, watch your step on the bus. And, of course, we would be saying A would be correct, right? In this situation back here, let me get rid of those. This situation back here, the situation is 2 friends talking about the surprise party they planned for another friend. The expression is, I'm worried that Mary is going to spill the beans to Andre about the party. What exactly does that mean? Mary will drop the bag of beans. Mary will keep it under her hat. Mary will let the cat out of the bag. Mary will cry over spilled milk. So the other sentence that would mean the same is Mary will let the cat out of the bag. Okay? Spilling the beans and letting the cat out of the bag. And of course, here's the lovely item and error analysis chart that I so much love. It is looking again at the open-ended questions here. I did forget to mention that. I apologize. There are open-ended questions, and then there are multiple-choice questions. So we're looking at idiom categories and error categories here, looking at transparent meaning and opaque meaning, literal meaning, close-in meaning, and unrelated meaning. And then we're looking at opposite, literal, and unrelated figurative expressions. Okay? So when you really think about that, if you start thinking about each of the tests that I talked about, you should be able to start, putting together in your mind what types of interventions you could start to develop or treatment plans you could start to develop based on the information you get from this. Right? So if you have children that are finding errors, or you're finding errors that are consistent across their tests, and then you start to see, based on the context evaluation of the checklist, where exactly should you start to intervene, or where can you start to intervene with these kids, and where would be the most appropriate. And I think that you're going to be able to find a lot of that information in here, right? So hopefully I'm able to show that. I was able to show that to you. You really should be finding a great start point for where you should intervene, or where you could start to intervene. Not only, of course, as I said before, for disability determination or deficit determination, but also for where intervention should be started. So let's get into a little bit more about the CELF5 Metalinguistics test, and just talking first about the diversity and dialectical variations that we have here. Like CELF5, the CELF5, of course, if you've seen any of or heard anything about the CELF5, it did go under an extensive bias review and had multiple research phases that included very diverse populations. So, like the CELF5, the Metalinguistics test had those as well. Also, there was a study with English language learners that really helped us understand the differences in scores and performance from typically developing kids and English language learners, or typical English speaking kids and English language learners. Sorry. And then there is also an alternate scoring for dialect speakers. So it's built into this test as well, that you can also think about how to score this in an alternate fashion for kids who have different dialects. I included these next two slides because I felt like this was a good thing to think about in terms of using accommodations. And really, this first bullet point here is why I included these, because when you think about working with kids from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, we are going to have a lot of differences, a lot of variation in their familiarity with item contexts. So how familiar are they with different contexts that are presented in the test? And by that I mean, things like pictures, vocabulary, questions, topics, etc., and the different tasks. So I think that, we are using this type of a test, and you're probably going to be called on to use this type of a test for a kid, or may choose to use this type of a test for a child from a diverse background, either culturally or linguistically or both. And you have to keep this stuff in mind. You have to understand that some of the metalinguistic function or abilities are going to be affected in these types of children. So you have to keep that in mind, of course. There may be test items that are included here that reflect values and beliefs that are culturally specific and don't apply to the background of the student, so you have to keep that in mind. So in these types of situations, you really may find it helpful to administer this type of a test using these types of accommodations. And these types of accommodations are going to be okay, and what I mean by that is, in these situations where you have to be able to use 1 through 6 here, they are, you can still use the normative data to develop or to derive a standard score. So I have the standard score with a check there because, there are situations where you're going to have to change or accommodate a student in a small way, but you can still use the normative data to get a standard score, and that's really important to remember here. So 1 through 6 here, explaining to the student the reason for being tested, it may help them. Allowing extra time for responses, we're not testing those, or we're not testing timing here. demonstrating, repeating, prompting for responses, and providing correct responses on trial items, increasing the number of trial items or practice items. And you remember that I said, if I remember correctly, if I looked back there correctly and I reviewed this correctly, repetitions are allowed on every test. So you can repeat as much as necessary for a child if you find that that's something that's important. Of course, within your clinical judgment. Number 5 there is just continue testing beyond the ceiling, and just to be able to see if a child has any skills above that ceiling level. Of course, in that situation, you would not award points for those past the discontinue point, but you could still look to see whether or not there are some splinter skills above the ceiling that may be appropriate to analyze for a child. And then that last one there is supplementing test results with language sampling, observations, parent or caregiver, teacher interviews, and dynamic assessment. And I think that that's really best practice, really thinking about this last one, number 6. And that's why the profile is going to be that much more helpful for you, or that much more beneficial to your overall assessment process, because it does include some of this, but also, you can, supplement this with other assessments as necessary. And then the next slide that I have here is really just thinking about accommodations where there are going to be situations where I know in my professional practice when I have to do assessments on different kids who I cannot actually use the normative information, but I still find that there's value in administering the assessment. You are going to have those situations. So you may choose to give the test to a child who is a little bit lower functioning, who doesn't have higher level language skills. You may choose to give this in a situation where you're going to have to make accommodations that would change your ability to use the normative information. So keep that in mind as well. And these are some different examples: rewording the test instructions, asking them to explain their incorrect responses. So basically letting them know that what they said was not correct, and that you want them to explain what they meant by that. Really helping them with that expressive component. Presenting administration instructions in both English and the student's first language, such as Spanish, or using alternative scoring procedures, giving credit to a response obtained after you provide additional prompts, or administer them in the student's first language. So let's say you go through this, you give it in English, and then you want to give it again in say they're Spanish, you want to give it again in Spanish. You can do that, but just remember, and I have the X down here, just do not derive a standard score, because you can't use the normative data. It's not appropriate to use the normative data to actually find a score there. So hopefully these 2 slides were helpful to everybody. I think it's real important to think about, I know it's real important to think about these 2 different slides, especially when we're talking about assessing children with disorders, or with language disorders, or another diagnosis. Okay, so let's talk about the scores that you get from the CELF5. So the first slide here are the test scaled scores. And for each of the individual tests, which I have listed down here at the bottom, these 5 here in a row, the profile, making inferences, conversational skills, multiple meanings, and figurative language, you're able to get scaled scores and percentile ranks, as well as the test age equivalent. So that's a descriptive score, or descriptive equivalent, not actual age equivalent. It's actual descriptive statistic of the normative sample. And growth scale values. So I'm going to put a bunch here because I love these scores. I'm going to just put them all over the place. Growth scale values. If you're not familiar with growth scale values, I do suggest that you go onto the speechandlanguage.com website and the Pearson website, pearsonclinical.com, and search for growth scale values. I did a presentation not too long ago, and put it together in they're called brain sharks. So it's a recorded presentation. I also have it included in some of my other presentations. I think I might have it in something on the TLS-5 or whatever. But so let me just give you a quick overview. The growth scale value is a great score, a great measurement for you to be able to track progress. So the difference is when you're looking at a standard score, any type of standard score, that score is a child's performance or skill level compared to their peers, their same-aged peers. So that is, when you look at a standard score of 100, that's at the 50th percentile. So what we're saying is that they are performing comparative to 50% of their peers, right? But what that doesn't do is it doesn't actually tell you what their specific skill is. It's just what their skill is compared to or relative to the population. What growth scale values do, and the reason why I love them so much, is because it shows actual skill level and then growth on that skill. So, for example, if I give Making Inferences, right, if I'm giving the Making Inferences test at time 1, and then I give it again at time 2, I can analyze the growth scale values to determine how much progress they made on that specific test alone, not compared to peers. So you compare 2 scores here. You compare the scaled score, which says, hey, this score is in the 50th percentile compared to their peer group, but they did make progress compared to their last test administration, right? So I think that that is, really going to be beneficial for you, and I really like it. I know how hard it is. I worked all of my school experience was working in special education settings, so I know how hard it is to measure progress over time, and using a standard, norm reference standardized test sometimes. So I think that anytime you see a growth scale value, pick it up and use it, because I think that you're going to really find value in that. Anyway, let me get off my soapbox. That's another thing I just really enjoy about tests when they include those. But you're also able to get composite scores. So I mentioned that this is a battery of standalone tests, but you are also able to get index scores. And again, you're able to look at metapragmatics, making inferences and conversation skills, as well as metasemantics. I'm looking at these 2 tests here for an index score. So you really think about that as pragmatics being the ability to use content in context to make situationally appropriate inferences and to initiate appropriate conversations given constraints set by word choices and interactive context. So that's how you would interpret that type of a test. Metasemantics is the overall measure of a student's ability to process and understand both sentences with multiple meanings and abstract, idiomatic expressions. So you could interpret it that way. Again, both of these scores can help you in determining the presence or absence of a language disorder. And then when we look at total metalinguistics, again, this is a measure of general metalinguistic ability. We are talking about quantifying a student's overall language performance, and when used in conjunction with those other 2 index scores that I talked about, it really can help you determine the presence or absence of a language disorder. So again, this is derived by summing the scaled scores of all 5 CELF5 Metalinguistics tests. So when you think about it, you should be really evaluating the index scores, so either the total, the metasemantic or metapragmatic index score, evaluating those index scores when you're thinking about disorder, of course, because there's less error when you're looking at an index score. When you combine tests together, we are looking at having less error. They're a little bit more psychometrically sound when we're thinking about making a high-level decision, such as a disorder decision about diagnosis. But then you can separate each of the tests out and look at the scaled scores and percentiles, etc., when you really want to look at errors, strengths and weaknesses. When we think about the assessment process, the CELF5 Metalinguistics process of assessment really is, what do I have here? We use this process, and I'll talk about it next, to look at their skills in everyday educational and social communication contexts. We are looking at determining language disorder and the nature of the disorder. We are able to determine the types or items of items that cause difficulty. So we're looking at strengths and weaknesses here. What error patterns do they have? And at what point can they be successful given task modifications? So in addition to not only looking at where their errors are, what level can we also expect them to achieve at metalinguistically before they need modification? When you think about the assessment process, this is just a great general process to really keep in mind. Step 1 is, again, we have to look at these skills in context. So by giving the checklist or the profile, really taking into consideration what their skills look like in context, then looking at the student's language competence and metalinguistic ability to obtain the information to be able to get a diagnosis, whether or not they have a language disorder would be step 2 in that situation. And that, again, is by looking at something like, so step 1 would be looking at the metalinguistics profile. Step 2 is evaluating the index scores to be able to determine whether or not a disorder exists. And then I have step 3 here as being, looking at the extension of strengths of the assessment process to look at strengths and weaknesses, really looking at where their strengths and weaknesses exist. Okay, I have about 10 minutes left on my stopwatch here, so let me get through these last couple of slides then, and I want to talk about some of the questions that I had at the beginning that hopefully you've been thinking about throughout this entire 50 minutes. When we think about this clinical decision-making slide here, I really like thinking about this because, when we think about an assessment process, we have to think about how applicable is that to our actual practice. Are we going to be able to use an assessment to make clinical decisions, to be able to make data-driven decisions regarding diagnosis, regarding interventions or treatment? And I think that's, this slide is almost one of the most important ones when I think about using a test. Quite frankly, if I pick up a test, I need to know that I'm just not giving it to get a score. I mean, all too often we see, test scores just being, tests being given, scores being interpreted or reported. But what really are you giving it for? Are you able to use this information for any use, for data-driven decisions? So, I like this slide. I like to think about these and just keep these in mind. But, yes, you are able to use this type of a test to be able to recommend any language adaptations and accommodations. Looking at whether or not a child is eligible, you can use it for eligibility for interventions or direct services. Again, looking at the norm reference information to determine whether or not they have a language disorder compared, or their performance on this test is impaired compared to their same age peers. Again, looking at their communication strengths and weaknesses, curriculum relevant interventions, measuring treatment efficacy. So I always think that, this is always a difficult one. Looking at interventions that are relevant to their curriculum and how do we tie interventions to curriculum. So that's always a hard one. And I think that's, this type of a test is really going to be, it's going to help you and it's going to be beneficial for those types of decision-making reasons. I have this sensitivity and specificity slide in here. Really the reason I'm showing you this is because I just want to make sure that you know that, using this type of a test, you are able to, you have very high positive and negative predictive power, and of course, as you see here, they're great when we're looking at being able to identify a disorder when it occurs, as well as not identifying a disorder when it occurs. So we have that, and it increases as we go down here. So we have that as we're going along, right? And they're very high based on each of the categories that I have highlighted there, right? So you can use this test with confidence that. Let me just highlight these. I'm sorry. Actually, these are the numbers I want to show you. They are very high and really have confidence in knowing that you can use this to effectively differentiate between kids with disorder and kids with not having disorder. And this is just a perfect example. This is part of the clinical studies group with a language disorder. So as you see here, this is the mean score for a matched sample here. This is the mean score for the sample with language disorder, and these are the differences. You see here that each of the p-values are statistically significant. So we see that in each of the categories, the difference between the matched sample and the sample with language disorder is clinically significant. Additionally, the standard difference here we're looking at is an effect size. What that does is that helps you differentiate between, when you have small sample sizes, looking at the effect size is a really effective way, or is a really helpful way, accurate way to determine whether or not differences are meaningful. And these numbers are just staggering to me when I look at them. I'm not part of the development team, but when I look at these scores, I take my hat off to the development team, because these scores are they're staggering. I mean, 0.80 is considered a high effect size. So looking at effect sizes of 0.173 all the way up, I see here 2.30. Those are really high. So the differentiation between kids with language disorder and kids that don't have language disorder is really effective there. And the other one that I have here is the autism spectrum study. Again, looking at the ASD kids over here, the matched sample here, looking at the p-values, again, all less than 0.01, which is all statistically significant. And again, looking at these effect sizes, look at that 2.97. That's jaw-dropping in my mind, because that's just really high. So again, what that really does is it really helps you say that whenever you have a kid here with a language disorder, or you have a kid with on the autism spectrum, you're really able to use this test. And when you find a kid who has low scores, that is a way to describe their performance, or a way to really link that. All right, so my last slide here, well, it's not my last slide, but my last thing that I want you to think about are these two questions. Again, these are two of the learning objectives, so hopefully through my discussion you guys were able to develop answers for these. So, the first one is, in what clinical situation would you choose to give the CELF5 Metalinguistics test? And I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds to just put some answers in the chat box. Feel free to type some stuff down there in the chat box, and I'll read some stuff as they come through. So what would you use? Actually, put them both in there. What would you use this type of a test for, and in what situation would you find it not to be appropriate, or likely not to be appropriate to use this test? I'll give you a minute, and then I'll wrap up. So go ahead and type some stuff in that chat box on the bottom left. School settings with middle and high school students. Absolutely, you would use that in a school setting. Sure. Anybody else have any? I think some of them were pretty straightforward. Students who seem to have good language per standardized test, but not in everyday situations. Great answer, Shelley. Public schools, yes. Low scores on the CELF. Significantly struggling with academics, Tammy. That's a great answer. Kids who have standard scores that are typical, and then they just can't perform well in the school. Wow, you guys are really coming through quickly. I can't read them that fast. These are some good ones, though. High-level autism. It would be helpful. Absolutely, Brenda. Yes. To consider pragmatic abilities of students with ASD. Absolutely. Can't perform on standardized testing. Absolutely. Typical versus lagging behind what's expected for their age. You guys are coming up with some great answers, and I apologize if I didn't get to everybody's, but you're typing them in so fast I can't get to them all that quickly. In what situation, then, go ahead and put some in there, too, that you would think it's not appropriate to give this test. Go ahead and type some in there. When wouldn't you give this? When do you think it would be a test that you wouldn't choose? I mean, quite frankly, this is a great test, but you don't give it to everybody. In what situation do you find that would be the case? Students who have low receptive expressive language abilities. Absolutely, Allison. That's a great one. Limited language fundamentals. Yep, Jessica, that's absolutely true. Obvious language disorders or low IQ, Kara. Absolutely. So, you guys are not with low cognitive skills. Absolutely, Shelley. So you guys are getting it right on. So hopefully, we're able to hit those last two perfectly, those last two learning objectives perfectly. You're right. Use this in a situation, all those that you mentioned, and, I would say it's not a good test to be used with kids who have low abilities, low cognitive skills, kids who have significant language impairment, of course, younger kids. In some situations, you may, I talked about using those accommodations. In some situations, you may find it beneficial to give this test to, a kid lower than the age range. But again, you have to know that you can't use any of the normative information for that type of an assessment. Just keep that stuff in mind. You're not using this with too young kids, not using this with kids who are too low functioning, etc. Okay, severely delayed language and significant cognitive abilities. Absolutely. All right, so I did have a question. Let me get through these last couple of slides, Marion, and I'll answer your question. Okay. So my last slide that I just wanted to show you is that there are some cool options, digital options here. Of course, for scoring and reporting, you can score by hand, of course, but you can also score and report by using QGlobal, which is the online scoring and reporting website from Pearson. And just have these listed up here. There are 5 free score reports that you get with each kit when you purchase. It is the same pricing itself, so it's $1 per report, and there are quantity discounts. There was also something that was recently recently released regarding Q Global, which is that there is bulk pricing, so you can have unlimited usage for a certain price. I don't have that up here, but please go to our website for more information about that. You can actually pay a certain fee and have unlimited scoring and reporting for a year or 2 years or whatever you choose. There's also some administration. There's an administration option on Q Global, and what I mean by that is there's a digital STEM book, the admin manual, and the tech manual. They will all be found on Q Global. You can purchase those separately and have digital copies. In this situation, you'd still use a record form when you're testing, but you can access the directions and items like the STEM book using a digital copy. So when you're sitting with a kid, if you have a laptop or what have you, you can actually pull that up, pull the STEM book up on your laptop, and have a record form in front of you and be able to administer that way. And then you would upload your scores into the Q Global profile, and then that would then score and report. Or you could hand score them. So you can do either one of those. You are able to adapt that for telepractice. So for any of those of you using telepractice or doing telepractice, you can actually use these digital copies to do that. And I don't have data on that right now, or instructions on that now, but we do know that several folks are using it for that situation. Here's some information. Check us out on social media stuff. We have USA information and Canada information. And let me just quickly answer one question, which is, I know we're finished, but Marion asked, can I briefly explain again how you determine growth, what's used to compute the data in the protocol? So you would compare time 1 and time 2 standard scores to determine how much progress a child has made compared to their peers. And you'd compare time 1 and time 2 growth scores to compare to determine how much actual skill progress they've made from time 1 to time 2. All right. Hope you all have a great day, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Adam. That was great. Unfortunately, you all get to listen to the ASHA CEU information just one more time. If you're listening to the live webinar event and want to earn ASHA CEUs, you must turn in your participant form to Darlene Davis, whose physical address I sent to you in an email before the webinar. Only those participants who follow the instructions for earning ASHA CEUs will have their course information submitted to the ASHA CE registry. And if you're listening to this as a recorded presentation on the website, no CEUs are offered. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to you participating in future webinars. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your lines. Have a great day, everybody.